are all good?
Yeah, I'm kind of interested actually. Hope you don't mind. Can I read over your shoulder? Hopefully bad manners.
This has
You know what's going on at the transportation committee?
I'm not sure.
That's not usually one of the ones you see, like a big
No, it's
crowd
not.
of reporters and people.
everything just sails right through. Yeah, I've seen like a controversial market before.
We haven't had anything. We've had this our two times. Yeah. We've had maybe 3 Venezuela. Yeah, like 3. Well, let me say this. 3 nationals, but we've passed like 70 bills to committees, and like 40 to 70. I think vice versa. Not as fun.
Not as fun when it's not controversial.
Yeah, I love it. I just see it. I'm like, right in the middle. We're wrong at it. I think it's not always it's the fun when it's great.
When can we expect to see members start falling in?
One minute now. I know there's one member back there. I haven't seen it.
Samantha under the weather.
I don't get sick. I get sick maybe. Maybe. More like maybe once every.
Right. Do you get your flu shot?
No, I'm gonna get it. I don't typically get it because I know.
Right, but it's not high enough for you to ever experience it now.
Yes, but
Weird.
it
That's
works so
that's what I used to
That's just-
say, and then you don't need to get it, and then when you do,
It would need to
it's
be
really
above
bad.
90%, and we're so
Okay. The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point. Pursuant to Committee Rule 4, the chair may postpone further proceedings on approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements or extraneous materials on today's business. As members were notified yesterday, we intend to consider 18 bipartisan measures and amendments en bloc. Pursuant to notice, for purposes of markup, I now call up the en bloc package consisting of 18 measures. And here are the measures: H.R. 2153 with an angle amendment, H.Res. 189, H.Res. 230, H.R. 1771 with an amendment in the nature of a substitute, H.Res. 410 with an amendment in the nature of a substitute, H.Res. 349, H.R. 4754 with an amendment in the nature of a substitute, S178 with an amendment in the nature of a substitute, H.Res. 585, H.R. 554 with an amendment in the nature of a substitute, H.R. 2881 with an amendment in the nature of a substitute, H.R. 3763 with an amendment in the nature of a substitute, H.Res. 446 with a Keating amendment, H.R. 1819, H.R. 4802, H.R. 4862, H.Res. 649 with an amendment in the nature of a substitute, H.Res. 546. At this time, I recognize myself to speak on today's business. Let me say I'm pleased to support all of the bipartisan measures before us today, and I thank our members for their hard work. I'll keep my remarks brief and highlight just a few of the 18 bills and resolutions. First, House Resolution 585 from Mr. Swazi, which reaffirms Congress's support for the historic peace that the Good Friday Agreement brought to Ireland. This is an issue particularly close to my heart. I remember my first trip as a member of Congress in 1989, traveling to Ireland, traveling to Belfast during the dark days of the Troubles. The Good Friday Agreement and the fulfillment of every obligation under that agreement is the only way to ensure that those times of violence and division never return. That's why I am so alarmed by the current situation with Brexit, which could reintroduce a hard border between the North and the Republic, a dangerous prospect not only for the peace process, but for the economic stability of the island and for the rights of the border communities. With this resolution, Congress sends a clear signal to the UK and the EU that any Brexit deal must protect the Good Friday Agreement and all its components. I strongly support this good measure, and I hope all members will join me in moving it forward. Next, I'll move on to two good measures that deal with 5G, a technology that has the potential to revolutionize so many sectors, from transportation to healthcare to entertainment. So there will be massive economic benefits for those who can quickly take full advantage of the new technology. But it also comes with big risks. As people become more dependent on wireless communications and generate even more data about their lives, the adoption of 5G will bring national security, cybersecurity, and privacy challenges. That's why there's such broad bipartisan consensus that it's important to assert American leadership in 5G technology to compete with China and others on the international stage, and simultaneously to protect the networks of the United States and its allies from spying eyes and cyber attacks. We have two bills in front of us today that address the future of 5G in a meaningful way. First, we have Ms. Spanberger's Secure 5G and Beyond Act of 2019, an overarching bill that requires the administration to develop a security strategy for 5G systems and infrastructures in the United States, to assist allies and partners to do the same, and to protect the competitiveness of U.S. companies. And we have Ranking Member McCall's Promoting United States International Leadership in 5G Act, which calls for a plan to promote U.S. leadership in international standards setting bodies for 5G. I'm pleased to support both of these measures that address this critical technology issue for the United States. I'd also like to highlight the Keeping Girls in School Act, authored by Ms. Frankel. When women and girls have access to education, they lift up entire communities with better health outcomes, economic well-being, and security for everyone. This bill calls on USAID to address the barriers to keeping girls in school around the world. It's a strong measure I'm proud to support. Finally, I'll turn to Mr. Sherman's amendment in the nature of a substitute to Senator Rubio's Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. Mr. Sherman's amendment, based on his Uyghur Act, shows the Chinese government that Congress will not condone their horrific human rights abuses against the Uyghurs in Western China. It builds upon the good work of Mr. Smith, Mr. Swazi, and our Senate colleagues by adding sanctions and export restrictions to make sure U.S. technology isn't being used by Beijing to oppress and mistreat China's ethnic and religious minorities. I strongly support all the measures we are considering today, and I urge all members to join me and do the same. And I'll now recognize our ranking member, Mr. McCall of Texas, for his remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just first say at the outset that yesterday marked a historic day in the House. For the first time in over 30 years, the House took action and passed a bill recognizing the historic fact that the Armenian genocide took place. 30 years. And I want to thank my good friend from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, who's been a champion on this issue, and for your years of hard work and unwavering support in getting this measure finally across the finish line. And I think it sends a strong message to President Erdogan as well. And I want to thank Chairman Engel for his, as usual, bipartisan cooperation in working together with me and my staff to get the Turkey sanctions bill passed in a unified voice from the Congress rather than a divisive voice that we see so often these days, a unified American voice against what Turkey is doing in Syria. I want to thank you for holding this hearing. Several important bills, including the Taipei Act, introduced by Mr. Curtis, and two bills authored by my good friend, Mr. Wilson. Today we're considering my bill, the Promoting United States International Leadership in 5G Act. China fully intends to become the preeminent global power using tactics like hacking, cyber attacks, intellectual property theft, and espionage towards its goals. Considering its long history of malign behavior and ongoing predatory practices, China's majority control of the world's 5G networks, interconnected devices, and cloud storage is a risk that we cannot accept. We must do better. We must compete. My bill better protects our national security and strategic interests by pursuing an alternative to China's 5G campaign, which is using state funds and predatory lending through the Belt and Road Initiative to increase market ownership of not-so-private companies like Huawei. Huawei was the support and malign influence of the Chinese government and is projected to gain more than 50% of control of the global marketplace and is positioning itself to gain even more. My bill will help the United States counter China's aggressive 5G expansion around the world by maintaining and in some cases increasing U.S. leadership and participation at international standard-setting bodies for 5G and future generations of mobile technology. It will provide a whole government approach to assess the security risks posed by China in 5G and increase cooperation between the United States and its allies and partners in not only identifying these risks, but in countering them. Another important measure by the committee today will be advancing is the Uyghur Act, which will impose consequences for the Chinese Communist Party's horrific repression of the Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities. The world must know that the Communist Party's crimes against its ethnic minority Muslims will not go unanswered. Secretary Pompeo rightfully calls these horrible crimes the stain of the century. The administration has taken action against the Chinese Communist Party by imposing visa restrictions on party officials, sanctioning entities that help build the party's technological police state, and banning products made with forced labor in the party's concentration camps. But more action is needed. Legislation before us will help today, and this bill will help expose the Communist Party's abuses and require the Magnitsky sanctions against perpetrators and ensure the U.S. technology supply chains do not help build China's oppressive surveillance programs and systems across the globe. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to supporting these and all measures here today. I want to thank you again for your bipartisan work with me and my team, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. Mr. Sherman.
I want to thank the chairman for holding this markup on these important issues, commend the authors on their bills and their leadership, and I'm a co-sponsor in each of the bills that are before us. I want to join the ranking member in taking a minute to recognize that we recognize the Armenian genocide yesterday. I remember 10 years ago in this committee, we passed an Armenian genocide recognition bill by only one vote, and then did not bring it to the floor because it wasn't certain that it would pass. Yesterday, it passed by an overwhelming majority and cleansed a stain on this government and this Congress for failing to recognize the first genocide of the 20th century, for participating in Turkey's genocide denial. That all ended yesterday. I want to commend our colleagues Schiff, Smith, Spear, of course, Engel and McCall, Eshoo, Pallone. But I also think we have to give credit to the man who was decisive in this, and that is, of course, President Erdogan. Without his help, we would not have been able to pass that resolution. I want to thank the chairman for bringing up the Uyghur Bill, S-178, authored by Senators Rubio and Menendez, which passed the Senate in September 11th. The House has companion legislation authored by our colleagues, Chris Smith and Tom Suozzi. In February, I reintroduced, along with the Asia Subcommittee Chair Ted Yoho and Conley and Wagner, H.R. 1025, the Uyghur Intervention and Global Humanitarian Unified Response Act, the Uyghur Act, spells Uyghur. Both these bills contain very important and complementary measures designed to increase the profile of and counter one of the most important human rights issues of the present day, namely the detention of over 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in Xinjiang. The Chinese government has sought to erase the distinct Uyghur Muslim culture and religious traditions through mass detention, re-education. They have involved the suppression of the Uyghur language, intimidation of Chinese Muslim minorities living even outside China, preventing Muslim minorities, including those with permanent residency status in the United States, from leaving the region, and they have sent literally hundreds of thousands, at least tens of thousands, of agents to live inside Uyghur households as a state monitor per family. The extent of this Chinese effort to Sinofy the Muslim population of Western China is staggering. So we've got an amendment in the nature of the substitute, which combines important parts of both of the bills that I've mentioned. This is just a start. I want to thank the ranking member and chairman, as well as the bipartisan staff, for working together to put together this ANS. I want to highlight two provisions. One is that we identify those persons responsible for the repression of the Uyghurs and apply the Magnitsky sanctions to those individuals. The second is Section 9, requires the Commerce Department to update our export controls and ensure that the Commerce Control List, which covers dual list items, is updated to create a special regime for China and identify those items that can be used for surveillance, mass detention, and deny licenses for the export or re-export of those items. Our staff has worked diligently with the high-tech community to make sure that this is not overbroad. This legislation is an important beginning. We need to go further. Most importantly, we need to ensure that our imports from China and the international supply chains relied upon by Western multinationals do not include items that are a product of slave labor. So I look forward to working with the committee on follow-on legislation, and I urge the adoption of the Sherman ANS and the underlying S-178. Finally, I want to say a few brief words about Karen Bass's H-Res 410 and Grace Ming's H.R. 1171, both of which deal with family reunifications between Korean Americans and their relatives in North Korea. Without objection, I'd like to submit a statement from Grace Ming for the record. Without objection.
Without objection.
Most people do not realize that there are 100,000 Korean Americans with family members in North Korea, while there have been 21 reunions involving South and North Koreans since the year 2000. Korean Americans have not been included in this, and especially as these individual age, is important for us to push forward toward family reunifications. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I, too, want to thank you and Ranking Member McCall for the historic day yesterday. The two bills that were up for consideration, I think, sent a clear message to Ankara that we are serious, and the recognition of the Armenian genocide embedded in the bill, and is just extraordinary. It's been a lot of years in the making. I want to thank Anna Eshoo especially, because it was her idea to bring it up now. So I do want to say the bipartisanship in both the debate and in that vote shows a common belief based on facts that are unassailable, that the Armenian genocide is one of the most horrific events that have happened in all of history, and that the Turks continue their all-out effort to say it didn't occur. Only brings further dishonor on Erdogan and on his government. I'd also like to thank you both for bringing up H-Res 649, a resolution which highlights the good work in the development model of the Inter-American Foundation. So soon after it being introduced, 50 years ago, Congress authorized the IAF to engage in grassroots development projects throughout the Western Hemisphere. IAF prizes community-led projects and small-scale entrepreneurship as a way to give underserved people a stake in their societies. It is about hand up and not just a hand out. Its sister organization, the African Development Foundation, and like it, leverages and encourages the financial and sweat equity of people in the community and has made an enormous difference in the lives of so many. It has a very, very low overhead in terms of what they use for salaries and the like, some 14%. So this is one of the best initiatives. It also promotes Feed the Future to ensure that its work complements but does not compete with projects of other agencies. I want to thank Albio Osiris, Chairman, for his strong leadership on this foundation for so many years, and also my good friend and colleague Rooney, the ranking member, for their support for the bill. Let me also say I'm very happy that the Uyghur Human, pardon me, the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act is up for consideration. I introduced the Uyghur Human Rights Act in the last Congress and in this one. This year we've had 118 co-sponsors, including many of the members of this committee, including the ranking member and Chairman Sherman. I want to thank them for that support. We even had Nancy Pelosi signing on as a co-sponsor back in January. So it's a bill whose time has come, and it will make a difference. I've chaired or co-chaired a number of hearings on what the Chinese government, what Beijing, particularly what Xi Jinping is doing to the Uyghurs. We're talking about concentration camps, the surveillance at all levels of their lives is unconscionable, and it's reminiscent of what the Nazis did in terms of rounding people up, torturing them, putting them into forced labor, and more has to be done to combat this. The bill is a comprehensive approach to try to end this egregious behavior on the part of the Chinese government. I want to commend the Trump administration for some of its actions that it has taken, including placing 28 government agencies and businesses on the Commerce Department's entity list. They have raised it repeatedly, particularly Secretary of State Pompeo, but more has to be done worldwide, more has to be done by us, Congress, as well as by the White House, because this is barbaric behavior on the part of the Chinese. Many of the goods that are being made there find their way into our stores. Recently, Costco, and we had very good information on this, was getting clothing for children that was being made in these concentration camps. So a much more aggressive effort needs to be made to ensure that Gulag-made labor does not find its way onto the shelves of our stores and outlets. So again, this is a good bill. You know, I would have hoped we would have passed our version sooner, like in January. But that said, we're doing it now, and that's a good thing. Reel back.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Sires.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. And I was here 10 years ago when we voted for the Armenian genocide, and I was very proud yesterday when I saw over 400 votes on the floor for this Armenian genocide. I remember the pressure that the Turkish government put on all the members that were on this committee to vote no, but we still were able to get it through with one vote. I also want to speak briefly about two pieces of legislation that are being considered today, HRS 649 and HRS 546. I want to thank my colleague from New Jersey, Congressman Chris Smith, for introducing an important resolution to support the work of the Inter-American Foundation. Over the last 50 years, the Inter-American Foundation has played a key role in advancing the economic development of countries in Latin America. It has achieved this progress by skipping over international contractors and issuing grants directly to local organizations. The Inter-American Foundation's achievement showed that promoting economic development in Latin America not only makes for more prosperous societies, but also advances American interests. I am proud to join Congressman Smith in leading this resolution. I urge my colleagues to support it. Second, I want to thank the chairman and ranking member for considering the bipartisan resolution I sponsored that will disapprove Russia's future inclusion in the G7 summits until it respects the territorial integrity of its neighbors and adheres to the standards of democratic societies. I introduced this resolution after the president expressed his intention to invite Putin to the next year's G7 summit to reiterate long-standing congressional sentiment opposing this choice. Since Russia was suspended from the G8 in 2014 as a direct result for its aggressive actions in the Ukraine, legislation supporting this decision and setting requirements for Russia's future inclusion has been signed into law. Russia has not changed course, but has become increasingly aggressive in the Ukraine and has undermined democracy in numerous other countries, including the United States. This resolution shows the House of Representatives is adamant that Russia must meet previously set conditions before they are invited to participate in another summit. I thank the committee for their time, and I urge my colleagues to support this resolution.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sires. Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have several measures before us today, so I won't get to all of them, but I'd just like to focus on a few. First, as the one of the founders and co-chairs of the Congressional Taiwan Caucus, I want to voice my strong support for Mr. Curtis's Taipei Act. Taiwan is a critical ally in the Pacific and ought to be a role model for other nations across the globe. Last month, the Solomon Islands and Kiribati switched diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing. The Taipei Act seeks to discourage other countries from making that same mistake. Unfortunately, these changes are a part of a concerted Chinese campaign. Since President Tsai was elected, Beijing has sought to undermine her presidency, to intimidate the Taiwanese people, and has increased its efforts to close Taiwan off from the international community. Helping Taiwan maintain its sovereignty in the face of this onslaught demonstrates our commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific. The Taipei Act also raises a critical question. Why don't we just go ahead and recognize Taiwan? The Taiwanese people don't want to be part of the PRC, and who can blame them after we've seen China's blatant disregard for the rights of Hong Kong people over the past several months? Furthermore, if you pick any mark of sovereignty, whether it's in economic, diplomatic, military, or governance domains, it's pretty clear that Taiwan has all of them. It's pretty obvious that Taiwan is an independent country to anybody who looks at the facts, and it's well past time that U.S. policy caught up with these facts. Moving on from Taiwan, I'd also like to briefly voice my support for 3 other bills that I'm co-sponsoring that we have before us today. First, the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, the House version of which was introduced by my good friend Chris Smith. And thank you, Chris, for your leadership on this and so many other issues over the years. China's inhumane treatment of the Uyghurs is completely dystopian and horrific. This legislation is critical to holding the Chinese government and officials to account for their campaign of abuse and mass arbitrary detention inflicted on the Uyghurs. Second, Mr. Wilson's Saudi Education Transparency and Reform Act, and I want to thank him for his leadership on this committee over the years as well, is a necessary step to ensure that Saudi textbooks do not encourage violence against non-Muslim religions. Third, HRES 349 reaffirms our commitment to our alliance with Japan. The partnership between our 2 great nations is essential to peace and security in Asia and really across the globe. It's also one of the best demonstrations that former enemies can put aside their hatred and build up an enduring, mutually beneficial friendship. As we face the threat of a rising China, seek to support democratic values and human rights, and work to bring economic development to the region, this alliance is critical to meeting our shared objectives. And unfortunately, the relationship between the United States and Japan oftentimes gets overlooked nowadays. It shouldn't. It's one of those that's so important to both countries, to the region, and to the world, and ought to be an example of how former enemies really can get along to the mutual benefit of both societies. So I would urge my colleagues to support these and a number of the other pieces of legislation before us. Thank the chairman and the ranking member for their leadership, and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chapman. Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you and Ranking Member McCall for continuing to work together to bring forward good bipartisan measures. Those efforts were on full display yesterday on the House floor when we honored the memory of 1.5 million Armenians killed during the Armenian genocide, and I commend you both for leading that effort. I am proud to support all of the bills this morning and to co-sponsor a number of them. First, I'd like to thank my colleagues for their efforts on behalf of women and children and human rights generally around the world, especially the human rights abuses against the Uyghur population in China. As the co-chair of the Congressional Study Group on Germany, I thank Chairman Keating for his resolution affirming strong U.S.-German relations and the importance of the transatlantic relationship. I thank Chairman Sires for his resolution opposing the reentry of Russia into the G7. Russian annexation of Crimea and interference in the elections of the United States, of France, and of other countries around the world demonstrate that it does not belong at the table until it acts as a responsible member of the international community and stops its efforts to undermine democracy. I'm proud to join Mr. Wilson, the ranking member of the Middle East, North Africa, and International Terrorism Subcommittee, in introducing H.R. 4802, which expands the State Department's Rewards for Justice program to those who provide information on sanctions evaders. Sanctions are only as effective as their enforcement, and while we know that sanctions are strategic tools and not a policy in and of themselves, this bill will ensure that we can better maintain the integrity of our sanctions regime and target those who seek to undermine U.S. and international objectives. And finally, I'm proud to have introduced H.R. 4862, the U.S.-Jordan Defense Cooperation Extension Act, with my committee colleagues, Mr. Wilson, Mr. Allred, Mr. Fitzpatrick, and our appropriations counterparts, Chairwoman Lowy and Mr. Rogers. This legislation, which passed the House last Congress, reauthorizes the 2015 U.S.-Jordan Defense Cooperation Act, ensuring U.S. support for Jordan's security and economic stability. Jordan has been a critical partner in our efforts to defeat and destroy ISIS. We all remember the horrific images of the Jordanian pilot downed in Syria and barbarically caged and burned alive. Jordan has taken in over 1 million Syrian refugees. We are grateful to Jordan for taking in their Syrian neighbors, and after 8 years, most refugees live in host communities where basic services like electricity, water, and education are strained. International technical and financial assistance and expanding job opportunities is critical to the future of Jordan. The U.S. must work with international donors to help Jordan make the necessary reforms to spur economic development.
The Kingdom of Jordan is a strategic linchpin in the region. It is in the national security interest of the United States to help stabilize our ally Jordan. With this legislation, we are affirming that the United States Congress stands by our allies. I thank my colleagues for the support of this and all this legislation, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Chairman Elliott Engel and Republican leader Michael McCaul, for bringing these important bipartisan bills to mark today. I am grateful to co-sponsor many of the meaningful measures before us today, and I am especially appreciative that 2 of my own bills will be considered here today. First to be considered is H.R. 554, the Saudi Educational Transparency and Reform Act of 2019, which I introduced with Congressman Bill Keating from Massachusetts. For too long, Saudi Arabia has played the role of both arsonist and firefighter in the fight against radicalization and violent extremism. While Saudi Arabia partners as a valued ally with us to combat terrorist groups around the world, Riyadh is also playing a negative role when it comes to radicalization. Every year, the Saudi government prints official school textbooks full of egregious material inciting hatred and violence against its own self-interest. For example, students are taught in one 2019 textbook that befriending Jews and Christians is, quote, a cause of God's affliction and displeasure, end of quote. Another urges children to declare, quote, the deceptiveness of the Jews, end of quote. Another book teaches children that Zionism spreads, quote, drugs and sexual diseases in many Islamic countries, end of quote. The material students are taught is so extreme that ISIS even used Saudi textbooks for its time when it seized control in Syria before it could publish its own materials. H.R. 554 recognizes this problem and seeks to hold our ally Saudi Arabia to its repeated commitments over the past 15 years to reform its problematic curriculum. The bill requires an annual State Department report to Congress detailing any intolerant material in Saudi Arabia's official curriculum. The hope is that with increased transparency on the issue, Riyadh will finally move forward with its promised reform to reduce the radicalization that threatens families both in the kingdom itself and the United States. I also appreciate the committee working for the markup of another of my bills today, H.R. 4802, which I introduced with Chairman Ted Deutsch. This bill would expand the Rewards for Justice program at the State Department to authorize rewards for individuals coming forward with information on sanctions evasions practices. The bill was inspired by the courageous Bassem Barabandi, a Syrian patriot and diplomat who defected at the Syrian embassy in Washington as he worked with anti-regime activists to provide passports to critics of the criminal Assad regime, which has been condemned for using poison gas against its own citizens. We are fortunate today to have First Secretary Barabandi with us in the audience. For years after his defection, Secretary Barabandi lobbied the U.S. government with information on Syrian oligarchs close to Assad and their sanctions evasion practices, including information on Samir Faz, who was ultimately sanctioned by Treasury this year. Secretary Barabandi's case highlighted the need to create a clear mechanism to incentivize individuals to come forward with this kind of vital information. H.R. 4802 will do just that and ultimately enhance compliance with U.S. and international sanctions, increase the confidence in the rule of law, and bring criminals and rogue regimes seeking to circumvent U.S. law and justice. I'm also grateful for Congressman Jim McGovern of Massachusetts for working on H. Resolution 230, which condemns all forms of violence against children globally. I was honored to work with him on this important resolution. More than 1 billion children are exposed to violence around the world, with lasting traumas both for them individually and for the societies in which they live. This resolution is critical, and I urge my colleagues to support it. And lastly, I want to thank my colleague, Chairman Ted Deutsch, for the important U.S.-Jordan Defense Cooperation Extension Act. Jordan is a valued ally that needs and deserves increased U.S. support. It was my privilege to work with him on this important bill, praising Jordan's success for its citizens. Mr. Chairman, there are simply too many good measures here today to comment upon. Thank you and Republican Leader McCall for this productive bipartisan markup today. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Ms. Bass.
Thank you, Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCall, for bringing these bills to the committee today for consideration. I specifically would like to speak in favor of H.Res. 410. The purpose of this resolution is to encourage reunions of divided Korean American families. I want to start out by letting you know that this resolution originated from a meeting where a group of constituents in my district called this issue to my attention. As I learned more, especially about aging Korean Americans who just want to be able to see their family members, I knew that I had to do something to help raise this issue. The division of the Korean Peninsula into South and North separated thousands of family members. Many Korean Americans with family members in North Korea have not seen or communicated with those family members in more than 60 years. Their children have grown up here in America without knowing what their cousins, aunts, or uncles even look like. Over the years, South Korea and North Korea have arranged for selected groups to visit each other, but these reunions have been dependent on the political situations between the countries. Meanwhile, the situation is now growing more urgent as many of those separated are getting older. Many are in their late 80s and 90s. Some separated families have taken a private route to contact their families in the North through third-party brokers. These unofficial reunions can cost about $1,500, but the process can be faster and less dependent on the political climate between North and South. People should not have to incur these kinds of costs just to reach a loved one, which is why I introduced this resolution that calls on the United States and North Korea to begin the process of reuniting Korean American divided family members with their immediate relatives. This resolution will provide an official mechanism to reunite family members so people would not have to rely on a backdoor method. A few months ago, I had the opportunity to meet with Ki-young Julie, a 90-year-old Korean-American man from Virginia who has not seen his 3 older brothers and an older sister since he fled North Korea more than 70 years ago. He came into my office with tears streaming down his face as he held onto my hand and urged me to do what I can to help Korean families to be reunited. Today, I'm proud to stand with my colleagues in getting one step closer to reunifying him and so many others with their families. With that, I urge you to support this resolution that calls on the U.S. and North Korea to pursue reunions as a humanitarian priority of immediate concern. I also urge you to support H.R. 1771, the Divided Families Reunification Act, introduced by Representative Grace Ming, that takes up the same issue from a different perspective. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Bass. Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to voice my support for the following measures, which I'm proud to co-sponsor. H.Res. 349, reaffirming the vital role of the United States-Japan alliance in promoting peace, stability, and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. This resolution emphasizes the importance of the U.S.-Japan alliance and urges further strengthening of our cooperation. Japan will continue to serve as an important ally against authoritarian aggression in the Indo-Pacific region. H.R. 4754, the Taiwan Allies International Protection and Enhancement Initiative, the Taipei Act of 2019. The U.S. government should support Taiwan in strengthening its official diplomatic relations. We have witnessed countries like Panama, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, the Solomon Islands, Kiribati fall victim to China's coercion and bribery. Due to this pressure, Taiwan currently maintains full diplomatic relations with only 15 nations around the world, and I too, like Mr. Shabbat, I think it's time that the United States recognizes Taiwan for the country it is. This bill also provides that it should be the policy of the U.S. to support Taiwan's participation in international organizations. This Congress, I introduced H.R. 353 to direct the Secretary of State to develop a strategy to regain observer status for Taiwan in the World Health Organizations. This legislation passed the House unanimously. We're also supportive of the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act of 2019. It aims to address human rights violation and abuses by the People's Republic of China's mass surveillance and internment of more than 1 million Uyghurs. And we had in this committee, we had a hearing on this where we talked about the armed crematoriums that they have in these facilities. And I think it's a repeat of history if we don't stay vigilant. Xi Jinping, the Chinese Communist Party, continue to commit horrific human rights abuses against their own people. This oppression must not be tolerated, and it is imperative that the U.S. government holds the CCP accountable for these abuses. If not, the Chinese Communist Party will continue this spread of its oppression and suppression of human freedom, not just in China, but around the world, like they have done with their unchecked expansion in the East Sea and the South China Sea based on their bogus 9-dash lines. They must be called out. H.R. Res. 189, recognizing the importance of sustained United States leadership to accelerating global progress against maternal and child malnutrition and supporting the United States Agency for International Development's commitment to global nutrition through its multi-sectoral nutrition program. Acute malnutrition continues to threaten the lives of over 50 million children under the age of 5 globally, and this whole-of-government approach will help combat global malnutrition because we know with malnutrition comes more conflicts. H. Resolution 446, reaffirming the German-American friendship and cooperation under the Wunderbar Together Germany and the U.S. initiative. The German government's Wunderbar Together, German and the U.S. initiative highlights the friendship between our countries and promotes cooperation between our people. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho. Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. I rise in support of 2 pieces of legislation. Senate Bill 178, the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act of 2019, and H.R. 2153, the Keeping Girls in School Act. I first want to applaud Senator Rubio and Representative Smith for their leadership on the Uyghur issue. The Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act of 2019 is a bill that addresses an issue that I have championed on the House side through H.R. 1025 and H.R. 649, and that I have raised in multiple Foreign Affairs hearings. The Chinese government's humanitarian abuses are well documented and include the targeting and mass detention of more than 1 million Uyghur Muslims in internment camps, detentions that serve no purpose beyond punishing religious minorities who seek to peacefully practice their faith. We often use the phrase, "never again," when reflecting on the darkest moments of the past. I believe that we have an obligation to remember that message right now and to think about what future generations will say about how we acted or didn't act in this moment. I've met with constituents in my community, including a Uyghur couple whose parents have been detained in northwest China and who are deeply concerned about their health, welfare, and access to medical treatment. They are calling on us to act on their behalf. As we know, public condemnation has not curtailed the Chinese government's abusive practices. And with this bill, we will take real action to identify the Chinese officials responsible for these abuses and impose sanctions upon them under the Global Magnitsky Act. And as China continues to import and use repressive surveillance and biometric technologies to target Uyghur Muslims, this bill will identify those technologies and require them to be placed on the Department of Commerce's commercial control list of items that require export licenses. This issue, and the issue of human rights more broadly, is of central importance to our bilateral relationship between the United States and China. I urge unanimous support for the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act of 2019, and I also call on my colleagues to continue to raise this issue with the State Department so that we can get human rights defenders, public health officials, and NGOs on the ground to provide Uyghur detainees with the care and treatment they need. I'd also like to speak out on H.R. 2153, the Keeping Girls in Schools Act. As this legislation describes, 130 million girls around the world between the ages of 6 and 17 are not in school today. And compared to boys in the same age range, girls between 10 and 19 are 3 times more likely not to be in school. Achieving gender parity in education isn't just a moral imperative. It's also an economic necessity for countries working to build more prosperous futures. Because when girls and women have opportunity, entire societies do better, with enormous gains in economic growth, productivity, and innovation. This bill mandates that the Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues, a State Department post that has been vacant since 2017, consult with the Senior Coordinator for Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment and the Senior Coordinator for International Basic Education Assistance at USAID to carry out a coordinated strategy and assess its outcomes. I ask my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join me in calling on the administration to fill the crucial post of Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues. Let's come together to pass this legislation with a resounding bipartisan vote so that we can demonstrate our nation's commitment to securing a future of equity and dignity for girls and women across the globe. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Wild. Mr. Curtis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to associate myself with so many of the comments made today, particularly those dealing with the Armenian vote that we took yesterday, as well as those that have highlighted the bipartisan nature of these bills before us today. It's a pleasant moment to have in an otherwise stormy environment that we're in, and I appreciate especially the leadership of the chairman and the ranking member. I don't think we get these types of bills without the support and the example of both of you, and thank you for that example. I'd also like to thank my colleagues for their support of the Taipei Act. It's an honor for me to put this bill forward, and I hope it's a very clear message to our friends in Taiwan that that friendship is reciprocated and that we appreciate their friendship over the many decades. Finally, I would like to be so bold as to speak for all of us here today in appreciation for the many men and women behind us and the staff that function both on this committee and in our offices. Clearly, we don't get 18 bills before us today without the hard work of many, many people. And I'd like to give a shout out especially to those in my office who've worked so hard on this and many other bills, and appreciate their service, which is frequently out of the spotlight. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield my time.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. Ms. Spanberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The United States has long been responsible for the groundbreaking achievements of the digital age. However, as we and our allies continue to build and develop 5G and future generation systems and infrastructure across the U.S. and with our allies abroad, the risks of foreign-produced and controlled equipment and systems becomes an even greater threat. The former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joseph Dunford, called the potential risks of a Chinese-built 5G network, quote, a critical national security issue. And NATO's Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence assessed that the Chinese firm Huawei's technology could be exploited by China to engage in espionage, monitor foreign corporations and governments, and support Chinese military operations. With my colleague, Representative Rooney from Florida, and our colleagues of both parties here in the House and in the Senate, the Secure 5G and Beyond Act would require the President to develop an unclassified interagency strategy to ensure the security of next-generation mobile telecommunications systems and infrastructure in the United States, and to assist our allies and strategic partners in doing the same. The strategy would also focus on protecting the competitiveness of U.S. companies, the privacy of U.S. consumers, and the integrity of international standard-setting bodies against political influence. The rollout of rural broadband internet access is one of my top priorities for my district in Central Virginia. But as we work to achieve faster internet speeds and wider connectivity, this legislation would make sure that we have a plan to deliver innovative technology to U.S. consumers, compete with China, and prevent foreign influence in 5G networks. I want to thank Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, for ensuring that this strategically important bill is considered in the Foreign Affairs Committee, and for their leadership. And I want to thank the members of this committee in proving that there is bipartisan support for safeguarding America's access to the next generation of telecommunications. I encourage my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Spanberger. Is there anyone on the Republican side that wishes to speak? Okay, if not, then Mr. Costa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member McCall for your good work and staff on this package of bills that will move on block, and I obviously intend to support them. I'd like to speak specifically, though, on House Resolution 189, recognize the importance of sustained United States leadership in accelerating global progress against maternal and childhood malnutrition and supporting the United States' efforts with the Agency for International Development, commitment to global nutrition through this multi-sectorial nutritional strategy. As a third-generation farmer and a chair of the subcommittee on livestock and foreign agriculture on the House Ag Committee, I want to state that I think what we all know intuitively, but maybe don't think about often enough, and that is that food is a national security issue. It always has been. We've been fortunate in this country to do so well in the production of food and fiber every night to be able to put on America's dinner table for healthy nutrition for our own country. But even then, we have food deserts in the United States, and we have kids that go to school hungry, notwithstanding the wealthiest nation in the world. The fact of the matter is that we're trying to address our own nutritional issues here in this country, but we also have a responsibility of the world's largest producer of agricultural products to provide a leadership role in malnutrition that is taking place around the world that leads to instabilities in countries around the world. Couple that with climate change and other factors that are impacting the ability of people just to have a daily diet in which they hope that they can subsist and sustain themselves. So I'm proud of this resolution because it attempts to address those issues of malnutrition around the world. It attempts to address the fact that when you have those kinds of conditions that exist, you have a situation in which instability obviously is a factor. And you couple that with the notion that climate change is going to make that security of food in many countries throughout the world that have these challenges, it is something that we need to keep our eyes focused on. Food is a national security issue, not only here but around the world. As a member of the Ag Committee and this committee, I want to make sure that we continue to work across the party lines to ensure, and the committees, to highlight the importance of international food and nutrition work, and this resolution does that. To sustain access to nutritional foods is a fundamental building block, I think, for stability around the world and growth. Children, we know, with enough food can learn in a much more sufficient way. Healthy meals mean our medical aid has a better shot at working because a lot of nutrition issues reflect to medical and health care standards. So I'm happy to support this resolution and look forward to continuing to engage with members of this committee and the House Ag Committee in a bipartisan fashion to ensure that international food and nutritional issues are part of our own efforts to not only maintain our own national security here at home, but to try to provide national security around the world in light of the factors and the challenges we face with climate change and with the fact is that planet turned 7 billion people 2 years ago. By the middle of the century, it's estimated that there will be 9 billion people on the planet. And how you feed those people will determine whether or not, in many ways, nation-states can live amicably together in a peaceful fashion. And therein lies the challenge. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Costa. Are any other members seeking recognition? All right, hearing no further requests for recognition, then without objection, the committee will proceed to consider the noticed items en bloc. Without objection, each measure is considered as read, and the amendments to each are considered as read and are agreed to. The question occurs on the measures en bloc as amended, if amended. All those in favor say aye. 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 All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The measures considered en bloc are agreed to, and without objection, each measure is ordered favorably reported as amended, if amended, and each amendment to each bill shall be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute. Without objection, staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. And this concludes our business today. I thank Ranking Member McCall and all of the committee members on both sides for their contributions and assistance with today's markup. The committee stands adjourned.